How is your citizen science project driving change?
A transition away from this idea that certain types of research can only be done in labs that have, federal funded grants and have, masters and PhD students running them. I think that what we've really tried to do is democratize that type of research to more people and find ways that we can train those people to generate data that is reliable to the point where then we can engage with them and provide some of that theoretical interpretation that might be needed for them to make sense of that data. So I feel like that's maybe the biggest change.
Example from the environmental policy, which are exposed to citizen science naturally because of the link to ecology and biodiversity, exactly like your network. And you've seen how it streamed towards the end of the presentation into research and innovation policy, and then into the culture change of how to change the practice of researchers themselves. So by the time we were talking about research competencies and the training of PhD students, that means that we're changing the culture of scientists in different ways.
Having our people with the mixture of the two knowledges, the traditional knowledge and the Western science, has now made us competitive, I guess you could say. So when things come through our area and the things that we need to look at, we could look at it on on an equal ground. And it's really making people accountable for their actions. It'll start making industry accountable for the stuff that they do. It's creating careers.
And Canada warbler was designated by CSIWIC in 2020 as a species of special concern using data from nature counts. CSIWIC, if you're not familiar, that's the committee which advises basically the government of Canada on which species to list as species at risk. And so in 2020, CSIWIC used all the historical data from nature counts, and they said Canada warbler is declining and it should be listed as a species at risk, a species of special concern. And then I love to see the data come full circle. And in 2023, Birds Canada participated in an international study which re-examined some of the ways that we assess species using the Canada warbler as its model, and then provided conservation recommendations for Canada warbler, all based on data from nature counts as well. And so not only can we use the data to assess species, we can also use the data to propose conservation for the species, and even to re-examine how we talk about species at risk. Data from nature counts is also really integral to identifying Canada's key biodiversity areas. These are areas of priority for the conservation of biodiversity in Canada. And they are, in much the same way that CSIWIC advises the government about species to list as at risk, KBAs are essentially advising that these areas, these places, are important for biodiversity conservation and should be protected. And these sites are a big part of Canada's commitment under the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So the Global Biodiversity Framework, the UN Global Biodiversity Framework, specifies a goal of conserving 30% of land and water by 2030. And Canada has committed to that goal, and these KBAs are going to play a role in that. And so that's very exciting as well. And finally, in 2022, data from nature counts were used to anticipate the impact of climate change by Parks Canada, basically in Canada's national parks. And I don't think about bird occurrence data as being a key in climate change, but they can be. And so the National Parks of Canada used data to try to decide how climate change is going to affect the birds that live in national parks, and how can the managers of national parks adapt their practices to help birds continue to thrive and survive as we see more and more impacts from climate change. And so I think that's kind of a nifty application that I wouldn't have considered at some point, that it can even be a key part in adapting to climate change. We know basically that these data are crucial. The value of data like this is starting to be recognized on the global scale. And this is a quote from that Global Biodiversity Framework, the supporting text in that Global Biodiversity Framework, that basically says that data are critical. And these data resources, good quality, accessible biodiversity data, is critical to conserving biodiversity in the future, and that it underpins every action that we might take. So if you want to do basically anything to conserve biodiversity in Canada or in the world, you need good data. And so that tells us that what we're doing is really key. What we're doing at Birds Canada is important, I believe, but also what you are doing as citizen scientists is really critical to the conservation of birds and other things